All right, in this video, we are putting the new 4070 Ti Super, which actually that's this one, the new 4070 Ti Super up against the 3080 12GB. I have the Asus TUF Gaming 4070 Ti Super. It's a 16GB graphics card launched at $800. And the 3080 12GB, I think I have a Gigabyte Eagle. I had to buy this one during the crypto apocalypse, so we got what we got there when I was able to find one in stock. And anyway, why am I actually stacking these two up? And again, it has to do with the pricing, because what I'm trying to look at in this video is the generational uplift at the same price point from the 30 series to the 40 series. So I'm about to flashbang you. Anyway, the 3080 12GB and the 4070 Ti Super. If you look at the specs, you might be like, why am I comparing these? A 102 die versus a 103 die. They don't have the same bit bus. Okay, but the 3080 12GB version, let's be clear, is also not the same thing as the 3080 10GB version, which was the original 3080. The 3080 12GB launched a while later. It launched in January of 2022, so 2 years ago, and about a year after the original 3080. And it launched at a higher MSRP. Originally, the MSRP was unannounced, but it looks like it was at $800 launch point. So basically, this was a card that came as a year later update to a similar price point to our 4070 Ti Super, which is coming in, a year later at the $800 to refresh the $800 price point within the 40 series. So I think the most direct generational predecessor to the 4070 Ti Super is, the 3080 12GB. So that's why I selected the 3080 12GB as our comparison point here. And no, the 3080 12GB is not the same thing as the 3080 Ti. That also does have 12GB, but it is a faster GPU. The 3080 12GB has a bit more CUDA cores and memory bandwidth than the 10GB version, so this is a bit faster than a normal 3080, and a lot faster if you're running over 10GB of VRAM, but it's not as fast as the 3080 Ti, if you want the scheme of the comparisons here. All right, we've established why we're comparing these. I think we should just hop into the benchmarks and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. We'll start our testing in Alan Wake 2, and we'll start without path tracing enabled. The high preset is the highest this game's presets goes. There's no ultra, nothing like that, although individual settings could be turned further, and again, no ray tracing enabled yet, although we will definitely take a look at that. At 1080p high settings, we're seeing the Ti Super hitting 26% advantage at 102 versus 81 in the averages, although both GPUs are doing great, and you would hope they're still doing great at 1080p. Let's move up to 1440p resolution, which is, I think, where more people would be targeting these GPUs. And we're seeing the 4070 Ti Super taking a 25% advantage at 74 versus 59 FPS. Although these are, good frame rates for both GPUs in this style of game. Alan Wake 2 is a very slow-paced game, a lot of just kind of walking and looking around, although there is some combat at times. So if you did want to take a higher refresh rate experience, we could kick on DLSS quality. I'm showing frame gen results on the far right, but the relative performance numbers will not be including frame generation numbers, and you can look at the latency numbers at the bottom of the screen there if you're interested. But anyway, we're seeing 105 FPS versus 86 with the upscaling enabled, no frame gen, which is a 25% advantage for the 4070 Ti Super. But let's move ahead to 4K resolution. At native 4K with the high preset enabled, no upscaling, we're seeing a 31% advantage in the averages for our newer generation card. It's 42 versus 32 though, so this is not an amazing frame rate for either GPU, so I really don't think these are the settings you would choose to use for either of them. So I think at least kicking on quality level upscaling, perhaps going more than that or even turning down a few settings would make sense. But with quality level upscaling, I think in a slower paced game like this, people will be very happy with the 54 FPS on the 3080 12GB. but you get a 26% bump going up to 68 frames per second on the new 4070 Ti Super. And that's without frame generation on, and you're at a decent base frame rate now to enable that if you so choose. But what about the path tracing mode? This is very interesting. We're seeing the newer generation card take a massive lead in the path tracing mode. Now we're pushing right up near a 12 gigabyte of VRAM allocation, so it's possible some of that's playing into it, but it could just be the newer generation RT stuff. Whatever it is, we're seeing 54 versus 31 at 1080p resolution, which is a massive difference, 74% advantage in the averages. Now, if you do kick on DLSS quality, which I honestly don't love to do at 1080p resolution, but the ray reconstruction does help out here. It's not awful. We're seeing a 59% advantage now for the 4070 Ti Super at 78 versus 49. They're definitely both playable now, although 78 certainly a much bigger number. And it's also a big enough number that you could kick on frame generation and probably have a pretty good experience. But what if we move up to a resolution you might actually be using here? Well, at 1440p, I think it only makes sense to use RT if you are enabling some upscaling on either GPU. So with quality level upscaling enabled, we're now seeing the 4070 Ti Super hitting 58 FPS average. It's a very good experience. And that's without the frame generation, which you could kick on additionally. The 12 gigabyte 3080 is hitting 35 FPS, so still not a great experience really. If we go to a more aggressive upscaling setting at performance mode, the 3080 is now more playable at 47. I would certainly rather play in the 40s and the 30s, but I really don't like the look of performance mode upscaling at 1440p output. The tree branches and things are really fizzly in the distance now and unstable. Don't love it, but it's a 53% performance advantage for the 4070 Ti Super, hitting 72 FPS there. If we move up to 4K resolution, then performance mode upscaling can be acceptable. It actually is how I played the game myself, albeit on a different GPU. And here we're getting 44 FPS on the 4070 Ti Super, so not a great experience here even with performance mode upscaling, and 27 FPS on the 3080, and this is kind of low frame rates for even frame generation in my opinion for the 4070 Ti. But I was curious if we'd see other path tracing modes see that same gigantic advantage for the 40 series GPU, and so I kicked on Cyberpunk's RT Overdrive mode, and at 1080p, we're seeing 49 FPS versus 37, so neither one's doing great, and it's a 32% advantage for the newer gen card, which is, not anywhere near the advantage that we saw in Alan Wake 2. And then if you kick on the quality level upscaling, we're now seeing 86 average versus 72 average, so they're now very playable. Again, I don't like the look of upscaling at 1080p, but ray reconstruction does help the stability a bit. But now it's only a 19% advantage for the newer generation card, so certainly some differences here. I do notice lower VRAM usage here, but I'm not sure that VRAM was the issue in Alan Wake 2, but this game certainly doesn't seem to allocate quite as much. If we move up to the 1440p RT Overdrive mode, we'll kick on quality level upscaling just to get playable on both GPUs. Now we're seeing 59 versus 48, which is a 23% advantage for the newer generation card, although that is getting it to 59 FPS, which is probably a decent baseline for frame generation, and the latency numbers don't look too bad there. If we did go to performance mode upscaling, now the 3080 is putting up more respectable averages, like 69, nice. But then the overall look of the image isn't great. The newer gen card puts up a 22% lead at 84 FPS average, and again, you could kick on frame generation, and that's a good baseline for that. But my main issue would be, like, if you look at the palm tree branches and stuff here, they're looking pretty fizzly and unstable. I don't know. Anyway, if we wanted to try out path tracing in 4K resolution, even at performance mode upscaling, I don't think either GPU is doing a great job. We're seeing 47 FPS on the newer gen card, which is definitely more playable than 37 FPS, and it is a 27% lead and a 44% lead in the 1% lows. But I still don't think it's hitting the performance numbers that I think you'd want to play in a first-person shooter. Let's move on to Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which is arguably the best-looking new game out there. And it does feature ray tracing, although it's not a full-on, path tracing experience. It does use ray tracing at all of its presets. And at 1080p Ultra, both GPUs are doing a great job. We're seeing 107 FPS versus 81, giving a 32% advantage to the newer GPU. What if we moved up to 1440p at Ultra settings? Well, now the 3080, in a first-person shooter, I'm not sure 56 FPS is what I'm looking for here. It's certainly playable. And 72 FPS on the newer gen card, giving it a 29% advantage. Again, very, very playable there, although, again, in a first-person shooter, I think people might look for a high refresh rate experience. We're not quite there on either of them. So one option would be to kick on quality level upscaling. This game does not feature DLSS 3 frame generation. It does have FSR 3 frame generation, but then you have to go into the FSR upscaling pathways, so there's a bit of a trade-off. So here I'm showing it with DLSS quality, no frame generation, but now both GPUs are doing a really nice job here at 108 and 84 averages respectively, giving a 29% advantage to the newer GPU, and things are still looking quite good. But if you do prefer to stay at native resolution at 1440p, you could try going down to the high preset. And now, once again, I think we're getting good frame rates for a first-person shooter. And this time, again, you are avoiding any upscaling artifacts if that is your preference. And now we're at 99 FPS versus 75 FPS in the averages. It's a 32% advantage for the newer generation card. But just to show that, if you're really seeking 100 FPS, minimum or whatever, you can go down to high settings and kick on DLSS quality. And in a lot of games, that's going to be the way to really get still a pretty good looking image that usually will hit high frame rates on both of these GPUs. We're hitting 138 versus 102 average, which is a 35% advantage. And even the 1% lows are pretty high now at 108 versus 80. Now, what about 4K resolution? Well, now neither GPU is doing amazing at the Ultra settings. We're seeing 40 FPS versus 32 FPS. So, I mean, the 25% advantage for the new card does certainly make it a lot more playable. I do feel 40 feels a lot better than 30, but it's still not the frame rate I would be looking for on these GPUs. So, I think it would make sense to adjust the settings a bit. Again, one option is to kick on some upscaling, and at 4K, quality level upscaling looks pretty good, and so I think most people would want to use it as an optimization. Here we're hitting 65 FPS versus 51 now, giving a 27% advantage to the newer generation card, 30% advantage in the 1% lows. And I still think that that's a bit lower than a lot of people would be targeting in a first-person shooter. So we could also try out the high preset. But the high preset without upscaling is probably not going to get the job done. Here we're seeing 55 FPS versus 42, which is a 31% advantage for the new gen card, and a 32% advantage in the 1% lows. And again, it's certainly playable on both GPUs, and if you don't want to do any upscaling or anything like that, you could use settings like these. But at 4K resolution, again, kicking on quality level upscaling, I think oftentimes the performance benefit is huge and the image quality differences are fairly minor. And so here we're getting 86 FPS now versus 66 FPS on the 3080. Which is giving a 30% advantage to the 4070 Ti Super, and again, 86 FPS average feels pretty nice in a first-person shooter in a single-player game, so looking pretty good there. Now, I want to look at Unreal Engine 5. Lords of the Fallen is the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 game that I have tested so far. And at 1080p Ultra settings, the 3080 is good for over 60 FPS, but it's only 67. We're not really high refresh rate experience here. Although on the newer card, we're getting 84, which is a 25% advantage. The 1% lows are a bit closer, but a lot of that's traversal stutter as you round corners into new areas here. If we move up to 1440p Ultra, now even the 4070 Ti Super is barely hanging on to an over 60 FPS average at 62. And the 3080 is down to a 48 FPS average. So this game is pretty brutal on its Ultra settings. Again, you could turn them down, but you could also enable upscaling. And I've noticed that in Unreal Engine 5 games, upscaling makes a massive difference to the frame rate. We're seeing frame rates bump all the way up to 93 and 75 respectively. That is a huge jump. And it's now giving us a 24% advantage for the newer generation card in the averages, 20% in the 1% lows. Again, the 1% lows are pretty affected by the frame time spikes as you round corners into new areas in Unreal Engine. Anyway, what about 4K Ultra? Well, we're now seeing 35 and 27 FPS respectively. It is a 30% lead for the 4070 Ti Super, but both cards have 1% lows in the 20s. This is really just not an amazing experience. So I don't think 4K Ultra is going to be the way you'd play the game on either GPU. So let's kick on at least some quality level upscaling to see what that does. And sure enough, that gives a massive performance bump in Unreal Engine 5, having the 4070 Ti Super now hit 61 FPS average. The 3080 is hitting 48, and that's certainly playable. However, you might want to turn things down to high with the upscaling enabled, or kick on a more aggressive upscaling setting. But I think that's enough of Lords of the Fallen. Let's go ahead and take a look at Baldur's Gate 3. And you might be like, wow, the 3080 caught up. Well, only because we're CPU limited here. In Baldur's Gate, you're more likely when you're having performance issues on pretty good hardware, it's more likely to be your CPU being the limiting factor. So even here on my 7800X3D in Baldur's Gate City and Act 3, both GPUs are basically CPU limited to a 120-ish FPS average. If we move up to 1440p resolution, the 4070 Ti Super can still basically reach the CPU limit of that 120-ish FPS, whereas the 3080 isn't. It's averaging 105, which is plenty for a game like this, but it's allowing the newer card to show off at least a bit of an advantage here, and it's showing a 17% lead. If we move up to 4K resolution, we are less CPU limited, and we're now seeing 81 FPS versus 68. So both GPUs are still extremely good for this style of a game at native 4K Ultra settings here. In fact, I think DLAA would actually be really a nice thing to try out here as well. I think it looks a lot better than the TAA in this game. But anyway, the 1% lows, you'll notice an advantage for the 3080. I think that was just some CPU-related stuttering as it rounded a corner, so I wouldn't read too much into that. What about Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3? I've chosen to test this game at the basic preset, so we're assuming you're kind of into, I'm going to take this game seriously, competitively mode. I want to push frame rates, not so concerned about visuals. So at 1080p basic, the new card is hitting 326 FPS versus 252 on the 3080, which is a 29% advantage for the newer card. At 1440p basic settings, we're still seeing a 29% advantage, but again, both are doing really well. We're seeing 255 frames per second on our 4070 Ti Super, and the 3080 is at 198. So both cards are hitting performance levels where if you're not getting the kill, I'm sorry, it was probably a skill issue. You can't blame your PC. But if we move up to 4K basic settings, we're still getting a nice high refresh rate experience at 157 FPS versus 127 FPS averages, which is a 24% advantage for the 40 generation card and a 30% advantage in the 1% lows at 96 versus 74. Keep in mind that's without any upscaling, so you could still kick on DLSS for an even larger frame rate boost, especially at high resolutions. In Starfield, we'll take a look at the Ultra preset, and at 1080p resolution, we're seeing 96 FPS versus 76 FPS in the averages, giving a 26% advantage to the newer card, although the 1% lows are more compressed at 58 versus 55. It's very possible that there are more engine or CPU-related things limiting those 1% lows, because interestingly, as we move up to 1440p Ultra, the 1% lows stay at 58 on the 4070 Ti Super, and you can see some spikes on the frame time graph that are related to, I think, loading things in as you move through the area, which wouldn't be so much of the GPU's fault, I guess, is what I'm saying. The averages are now 79 versus 61 at 1440p, which is a 30% advantage to the newer card. And what if we kick on DLSS, because this is a first-person shooter style game, so you might be chasing a higher refresh rate experience. Without frame generation, the 4070 Ti Super hits 95 FPS and is showing some signs of CPU limitation if you see its GPU usage kind of in the lower 90s usually, rather than near 100. The 3080 12 gigabytes hitting 77, so we're seeing a 23% advantage in the averages, less in the 1% lows, although frame generation helps push past CPU limited situations, so that was putting up some pretty good numbers there. At 4K Ultra, no upscaling, no frame generation. The 4070 Ti Super is not quite good for 60 FPS in New Atlantis. It's hitting 53. The 3080 12 gigabyte is averaging 40, and that gives a 33% advantage to the newer card in the averages and a 24% advantage in the 1% lows. But I don't think you'd probably play at those settings, so one option would be to enable quality level upscaling, which again at 4K resolution I think makes a lot of sense. We're now hitting 72 frames per second on the 4070 Ti Super and 56 on the 3080 12 gigabyte, giving a 29% advantage to the newer card, although the 1% lows are again more compressed at 50 versus 46. But again, like I said, I think those spikes in the frame time graph are often predictable little loading things. If we move on to RE Engine, we can test out Resident Evil 4 Remake at its maximum preset, which does include a lot of VRAM allocation and a little bit of ray traced reflections. Although they're pretty low res and don't look all that great, we're still hitting good performance numbers at 1080p max at 169 versus 131, 29% advantage for our newer graphics card. What about 1440p resolution? At the max settings, we're still hitting great numbers on both GPUs at 136 versus 103. This is a very performant engine, and it still looks really nice for what especially for the performance that you're getting here. And again, this is no upscaling. 136 versus 103, 32% advantage on the for the 4070 Ti Super, and a 35% advantage in the 1% lows. Frame time graphs look smooth. What about 4K resolution? Well, at maximum settings, even the 3080 is still averaging over 60. We're hitting 64 FPS average, and the 4070 Ti Super is hitting 81 FPS average, which is a 27% advantage. This engine tends to be very performant and look quite nice. I think that's enough benchmarks for today. Let's pop out for some final thoughts. All right, well, what do I think? Well, I mean, that depends on what is even our purpose of this video. I mean, I was interested in seeing the generational uplift. Some people watching this video, though, might have a 3080 and be wondering, like, is the 4070 Ti Super what I should upgrade to, since it's kind of a new card at maybe roughly the price I paid for my 3080? Well, I think if you're thinking about the upgrade, I mean, it's certainly the case that this new card is better than a 3080, but it's not, I think, providing you an entirely different class of experience in most situations, to where I would recommend holding off on the upgrade until the 50 series. Now, in general, my thoughts on GPU upgrades are, if you're not going to get at least 50% more performance, then you're probably going to be a bit underwhelmed by the upgrade, given that you're going to have to go through probably selling your old GPU, getting the new one. Maybe you're out of a GPU for a while in between, and you know you're losing money on the transaction. You're spending the additional stuff, and if you're only getting, you know, like we're seeing here, 24% performance uplift in Lords of the Fallen, like, does that really meaningfully change your experience? Whereas if you're getting more like a 50% performance bump, or, you know, my personal preference was always to upgrade when I could double my performance at about the same price. That was always when I felt it was most worth it, or maybe even not at the same price, but if I could afford to double my performance, that seemed worthwhile, right? Going from 30 to 60 is a very meaningfully different experience, or from 60 to 120, that's a very meaningfully different experience, right? So anyway, that's always been my thoughts on that. And we're not getting that type of uplift here. So I think holding off for another generation, also given the fact that 3080, when adjusted to the correct settings, is still putting up a great experience, I would say, especially if you're playing at 1440p resolution. I mean, one of the newest, best-looking games out there, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, and I'm testing the most demanding section of the benchmark. when I'm giving these numbers here, I mean, with ultra settings DLSS quality, still hitting 84 FPS average, right? That's not a problem really, right? So I think you're still could be happy with that experience and push off that upgrade a little bit longer. Now, the other kind of purpose for this video, like I said, was just looking at the interesting, see if we found any interesting differences between the two cards and, you know, what I think of the generational difference. Is it okay for a generational uplift to only be kind of around this 30% number? And what would we put the number at? Like sometimes we're getting an uplift in the 20s, you know, 25-ish, sometimes 30-ish, sometimes closer to 35. I think if we wanted to put some sort of just a ballpark figure on it that's reasonable, let's call it a 30% uplift, right? So a 30% uplift generationally when also getting a bit of an increase to energy efficiency, so at lower power. You're also getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM now. I think if this had been the card we got at the beginning of the 40 series, I think it would have been met with, okay, it's fine. I don't think it would have made anybody like flip out over its amazing deal or anything like that. But I think it would have been like, okay, 16 gigabytes of VRAM at $800. 30% uplift over the previous generation. Again, if you compare it to the actual 10 gigabyte 3080, it's even a little bit more impressive, right? I think that's one thing. I think the main thing holding off the excitement on these is that we had to wait for the Super Series to get it, so it's a year later, right? So that's, you know, where I think it's a bit less exciting, right? Anyway, and then anything interesting we saw in the 30 series versus 40 series kind of results here. Again, most of these were pretty uneventful, showing somewhere in, like I said, that 25 to 35% performance uplift range, other than if you got CPU limited in like Baldur's Gate or something like that, until we look at the specifically Alan Wake 2 path tracing results, where this, at first, when I was stacking that up, I was like, the first one I looked at was the 1080p RT high, and I was like, 74%, that seems wrong. Did I test the 12 gigabyte 3080 wrong? Is it running out of VRAM? What's going on here? And then I remembered, okay, I have already also tested my 3090 recently up against a 4070 non-TI Super. And in that result, we were also seeing the 40 series putting up a better than expected result versus the 30 series running the same test. So what this looks like to me is actually just the fact that it seems like this particular ray tracing mode is a lot more optimized for NVIDIA's 40 series than their 30 series. Because again here, and again, if we compare the 3090 results, I have the Founders Edition in this video, hitting 35 FPS in the same exact test scenario, and these tests were all run within a week or two of each other. The 3080 12 gigabyte hitting 31 FPS, right? 31 versus, the 35 we saw here. 3080 12 gigabyte versus 3090, usually not a huge performance gap there. We're seeing 4 FPS difference. That's fairly expected within the product stack. And here, 4070 non-TI Super hitting 39, the 4070 Ti Super hitting 54. Again, I think not an entirely unreasonable, uplift within the 40 series product stack there as well, although a bit better than normal. I think the 4070 Ti Super, this is one of the games where it's increased memory bandwidth going up beyond where the 4070 Ti and the 4070 Super, the 12 gigabyte cards are at, paid off within its 40 series uplift. And we saw better uplifts here than we do in most other situations on the 4070 Ti Super. So I think this result is explained by a combination of this mode just being better optimized for the 40 series, combined with this being a particularly good result for the 4070 Ti Super. And that explains why we're getting this kind of outsized lead, which again did shrink a bit like when you kicked on upscaling and things like that. But again, that was certainly the biggest result. And I think that also if you are looking at the, are we getting a meaningfully different generational, experience here? The combination of you do get the frame generation option on the 40 series, plus this increased path tracing performance. I wonder, by the way, I know NVIDIA had talked about with the 40 series launch some 40 series specific optimizations like shader execution reordering. I wonder if we're seeing that paying off here with the 40 series. That's just sort of a random thought. But anyway, we're definitely getting a much higher, let's move to the 1440p result. Like 1440p, ray tracing high, DLSS quality, so you're in your path tracing mode, and even without frame generation, the newer GPU can hit about 58 here. And that's a decent baseline for frame generation, which it can also use. And now you're hitting, up into the 90s. Again, that's not equivalent, latency-wise and all that. But whatever. The point is, I think the most meaningfully different experience that the newer card here seems to enable is some of the path tracing modes at 1440p with acceptable upscaling does become a lot more usable. And I think we see that in Cyberpunk as well, where 1440p RT Overdrive DLSS quality does kind of hit that magic just around 60 FPS number on the newer generation card, although the uplift here is a lot less meaningful. You then can kick on the frame generation when it's available, although in games the 30 series GPUs are now starting to be able to mod in like FSR3 frame generation. And that's, certainly interesting, and it's not quite as good or the same, but it is certainly kind of diminishing the shine of the new feature set and everything. But anyway, I think that's enough thoughts on this. In general, like I said, I think if you're already on a 3080 class card, probably wait for the 50 series to upgrade. But it was still fun taking a look at the scaling here, and I hope all of you have an excellent day, and especially huge thank you to channel members who have clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially, which I understand not everybody's in a financial position to do, so that is totally fine. Anyway, but those who have, when I'm running through this many benchmarks on this many GPUs, with so many GPUs launching this month and everything like that, it's nice to have the motivation of feeling that people must really value what I'm doing here to kind of push through that. That really helps. So again, but also so does, just the views, subscribers, commenters, all of that. It's all so helpful, and huge thank you to everybody. You're all beautiful people, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.